Welcome, listeners, to Anana's Creation. Tonight, we journey into a world of myth and legend, reimagined for a new time. Forget what you think you know about the God of Thunder. This is a story of a different kind of power, a power that resonates not just in the crash of lightning, but in the steady beat of a courageous heart. This is Thor, more than just the God of Thunder. Our story begins not in a distant, glittering realm of gods, but in the quiet, fog-drenched town of Havenwood, nestled deep within the towering redwood forests of Northern California. Havenwood was a place where time seemed to slow, where the scent of pine and damp earth hung heavy in the air, and where secrets clung to the ancient trees like moss. Our hero isn't a golden-haired immortal, at least, not that he knows of. He is Mason, a young man whose life has been anything but ordinary. Mason was a blacksmith, a trade passed down through his family for generations. His hands, calloused and strong, could cook steel into any shape he desired, from the sturdy plowshares for local farmers to the intricate iron gates that guarded the town's oldest estates. He was known for his quiet strength, his unwavering honesty, and a sense of responsibility that seemed too heavy for his 24 years. Life in Havenwood was predictable, a comforting rhythm of seasons. But lately, a strange disquiet had settled over the town. The rains had been relentless, turning the rich soil into a muddy soup and threatening the year's harvest. A peculiar sickness had befallen the livestock, and an unnatural chill seemed to linger in the air, even on the sunniest of days. The townsfolk, practical and hardworking people, were beginning to whisper. They spoke of old legends, of a curse that slumbered in the heart of the forest. One evening, as a particularly vicious storm raged outside, Mason was working late in his forge. The rhythmic clang of his hammer against the anvil was a familiar counterpoint to the howling wind and the drumming rain. He was finishing a set of specially crafted horseshoes for Mr. Henderson, the owner of the largest farm in the valley, whose prized stallion had fallen ill. Suddenly, the heavy oak door of the forge creaked open, and a gust of wind and rain swept in, extinguishing half the lanterns and sending sparks dancing from the fire. Framed in the doorway stood a figure, cloaked and hooded, their face obscured by shadows. It was a woman. She was old, her back bent with the weight of years, but her eyes, when she finally looked up, seemed to burn with an intensity that defied her age. It was Evelyn, a reclusive old woman who lived on the edge of the woods, a person most townsfolk avoided, calling her a witch behind her back. "The storm is getting worse, Mason," she rasped, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "It is not a natural storm. An ancient anger is stirring." Mason wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his leather-gloved hand. He had always been taught to be respectful to his elders, no matter their reputation. "It's a bad one for sure, Evelyn. Come in, dry yourself by the fire." She took a hesitant step inside, pulling her damp cloak tighter around her frail form. She ignored the offered warmth of the forge. "The Henderson stallion, it's not just a sickness. It's a blight. The land is weakening. The heart of the forest is failing." Mason paused, his hammer held aloft. He had heard the whispers, but hearing them spoken with such certainty by Evelyn sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "What do you mean? What's happening?" Evelyn's gaze drifted to a corner of the forge, where a heavy, iron-bound chest lay, a family heirloom that had sat untouched for as long as Mason could remember. His father had always told him it contained old tools, nothing of value. "Your father, he was a good man," Evelyn said, her voice softening slightly. "He was a protector, just like his father before him. He knew the secrets of this land. He knew that Havenwood was not just a town, but a guardian. And he knew that the greatest protection lay not in walls or weapons, but in heritage." She pointed a trembling finger at the chest. "The time has come, son of Aaron. The whispers in the storm are calling for you. They are calling for the strength that sleeps in your bloodline. The key is in your father's locket." Mason's hand instinctively went to the small, tarnished silver locket he wore around his neck, a gift from his father on his 18th birthday, just before he passed. He had never taken it off, but he had never tried to open it either. It had seemed too personal, a final, silent memory of the man who had taught him everything. With a sense of trepidation, he worked the clasp. It was stiff, but it finally gave way. Inside, nestled against the faded velvet, was not a picture, but a small, intricately carved iron key, shaped like a lightning bolt. It was old, ancient even, and it hummed with a faint, almost imperceptible energy against his skin. His eyes met Evelyn's. The stories, the whispers, the strange events in town, suddenly, they felt like pieces of a puzzle he was only just beginning to see. The forge, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt like the edge of a great and terrifying mystery. The storm outside seemed to intensify, and in the sound of the wind, Mason could almost hear voices, ancient and powerful, calling his name. He was a blacksmith, a simple man from a small town. But as he held the key in his palm, he felt a surge of power, a connection to something far older and greater than himself. The whispers in the storm were no longer just a sound. They were a summons, and his life was about to change forever. The iron key felt unnaturally warm in Mason's palm, a stark contrast to the damp chill that had settled deep within the forge. Outside, the storm shrieked, no longer a random act of nature, but a symphony of chaos that seemed to be playing just for him. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the storm's fury. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring at the old, iron-bound chest in the corner. It had been a silent fixture in his life, a mundane object he'd stacked firewood against, a surface for his dusty tools. Now, it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a treasure chest of secrets waiting to be unlocked. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Mason knelt before it. The key, shaped like a bolt of lightning, slid into the ancient lock with a surprising smoothness, a perfect fit. He hesitated, his knuckles white as he gripped the key. What was he about to uncover? Was he ready for the answers? The memory of his father, Aaron, flashed in his mind, a kind man with a gentle smile and hands as strong as the steel he worked. He had been a man of simple truths and hard work. What secrets could he have possibly kept? With a decisive twist, Mason turned the key. There was a low, resonant thunk as the internal mechanism, silent for decades, finally gave way. The sound was swallowed by a deafening clap of thunder that shook the very foundations of the forge. He lifted the heavy lid, its iron hinges groaning in protest. An earthy scent, a mix of old leather, cold iron, and something else, something electric, like the air after a lightning strike, wafted out. Inside, there were no blacksmithing tools. Instead, resting on a bed of faded velvet, were three objects that seemed to absorb the flickering firelight. The first was a pair of thick leather bracers. They were dark, almost black with age, and etched with spiraling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the low light. They looked like they were made for battle, for protection against more than just heat and sparks. As his fingers traced the worn leather, he felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if he had worn them 1,000 times before. Beneath the bracers lay the second object, and it was this that stole Mason's breath. It was a hammer, but it was unlike any hammer he had ever forged or wielded. The head was a solid block of dark, unblemished iron, perfectly square and impossibly dense. The handle was crafted from the heartwood of a yew tree, wrapped tightly in strips of worn leather. It was a weapon, a tool of immense power, designed for a purpose far beyond shaping metal. When he reached in and lifted it, he was shocked by its weight. It was heavy, yet perfectly balanced. It felt less like an object in his hand, and more like an extension of his own arm. It hummed with the same latent energy as the key, a low thrum of power that resonated up his arm and settled in his chest. The final item was a journal, its leather cover cracked and weathered with age. On the front, his father's initials, AJ, were embossed in faded gold leaf. With trembling hands, Mason lifted the journal and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was his father's, strong, clear, and familiar. But the words were not. "To my son, Mason," it began. "If you are reading this, then the fragile peace I have spent my life guarding has been broken, and the duty of the guardian has fallen to you. I am sorry for the weight I am about to place on your shoulders, and I am sorry for the secrets I had to keep." Mason sank back on his heels, his mind reeling. Guardian? The word felt foreign, nonsensical. He read on, his eyes flying across the pages. His father wrote not of harvests and horseshoes, but of a sacred trust passed down through their bloodline for generations. Their family, the Johnsons, were not just blacksmiths. They were protectors of Havenwood, and more specifically, of something called the Heartwood, an ancient, living entity deep in the forest that was the source of all life and balance in the valley. It was the reason the trees grew so tall, the soil was so rich, and the water ran so pure. His father's journal described an ancient, slumbering entity of decay and shadow, a force known only as the Blight. For centuries, this entity had been held in check, kept dormant by the strength of the Heartwood and the vigilance of the Guardians. But the journal spoke of a cycle, a time when the Blight would stir from its slumber, its corrupting influence seeping into the land like a poison. The relentless rains, the sick livestock, the unnatural chill, they were not random misfortunes. They were symptoms. The Blight was waking up. A wave of disbelief washed over Mason. This was the stuff of the fairy tales Evelyn would tell the town's children. His father was a blacksmith, a good, honest man, not some mythical warrior from a forgotten legend. He slammed the journal shut, his knuckles rapping against the hard leather. It was too much. A trick. A cruel joke. But as he looked at the powerful hammer resting on his lap and the warrior's bracers beside him, doubt began to creep in. He had always felt different. He possessed a strength that even he didn't understand, a resilience that other men lacked. He could work the forge for 18 hours straight without tiring, and he could lift weights that would buckle other men's knees. He had always dismissed it as a simple gift of his trade. But what if it was more? As if in answer, a blinding flash of white light filled the forge, followed by an earth-shattering crack. It was louder than any thunder he had ever heard. The ground trembled. Mason scrambled to his feet, rushing to the door and peering out into the torrential downpour. A massive redwood, the oldest in Havenwood, one that stood on the hill just beyond his forge, had been struck by lightning. But it wasn't burning. Instead, the entire tree was bathed in a soft, pulsating blue light, ethereal and otherworldly. Veins of energy coursed through its bark like glowing sap. Mason's gaze fell from the luminous tree back to the iron hammer in his hand. He realized the low hum he felt from the weapon had intensified, its vibration matching the pulse of the glowing tree. It was a connection, a calling. Evelyn's words echoed in his mind. An ancient anger is stirring. The whispers in the storm are calling for you. The storm was not a storm. It was a warning. The journal was not a story. It was his inheritance. Standing there, silhouetted against the raging tempest and the glowing, impossible tree, Mason felt the simple life of a blacksmith being stripped away, replaced by a terrifying and solemn truth. The weight of the hammer in his hand was no longer just the weight of iron and wood, but the weight of a legacy. He was the son of Aaron, a guardian, and his fight was just beginning. The ethereal blue light in the ancient redwood faded, leaving behind an eerie silence that was somehow more deafening than the storm's previous fury. Rain continued to fall, but the wind had quieted to a low, mournful whisper. Mason stood drenched in the doorway of his forge, the heavy iron hammer in his hand, its presence a solid, undeniable truth. The world he knew, a world of heated steel, honest labor, and the simple rhythms of small-town life, had fractured. In its place was a reality of magic, monsters, and a destiny he never asked for. Fear was a cold knot in his stomach. He wanted to throw the hammer down, barricade the door, and pretend none of this had happened. He could wake up in the morning and dismiss it all as a vivid, storm-induced nightmare. But he knew he couldn't. He had seen the truth in Evelyn's eyes, read it in his father's own words, and felt it in the impossible energy that coursed from the hammer into his very bones. The sickness in the town, the desperation in his neighbors' faces. It wasn't a nightmare. It was real. And if he did nothing, it would only get worse. His jaw tightened with resolve. He was his father's son. He would not shy away from a duty, no matter how terrifying. His first instinct was clear. He needed to find Evelyn. She had started this, and she was the only person who might have more answers than the cryptic journal in his pocket. Turning back into the forge, Mason moved with a new, deliberate purpose. He left his blacksmith's apron on its hook. He looked at the half-finished horseshoes for Mr. Henderson's stallion and felt a pang of sorrow for the simple problems he used to solve. He then picked up the ancient leather bracers. As he slid them onto his forearms, the cold leather seemed to warm and tighten, molding to his skin as if it recognized him. The spiraling patterns etched into them seemed to pulse with a faint light, visible only for a second. They felt less like armor and more like a part of him. He secured the hammer to a thick leather loop on his work belt, the weight a comforting and intimidating presence at his side. He caught his reflection in a shard of broken mirror, the same face, the same broad shoulders, but his eyes held a different light. He was no longer just Mason the blacksmith. He was a guardian. Stepping out into the relentless rain, he set off towards the edge of the woods where Evelyn lived. The journey, Usually a short walk became a treacherous ordeal. The storm, though quieter, had a malevolent intelligence. The wind seemed to whisper his name in mocking tones. Low-hanging branches, heavy with rain, seemed to grab at his clothes like skeletal fingers. The path was lost under a torrent of muddy water, and familiar landmarks were shrouded in a disorienting mist that swirled and eddied with no discernible pattern. The forest, once a place of peace for him, now felt alive and hostile, its very essence tainted by the growing blight his father had written about. After what felt like an hour of struggle, he saw a faint, warm light ahead. It was a single lantern, hanging from the porch of Evelyn's small, secluded cottage. The house was a bastion of tranquility in the chaos, seemingly untouched by the storm's rage. As he approached, the front door opened before he could knock. Evelyn stood there, a simple shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her expression calm and knowing. "I was wondering when you would come," she said, her voice steady. "Your father's spirit is strong in you. He was always resolute, even in the face of the darkest shadows."
"Come in, child."
"You have questions." Inside, a fire crackled warmly in a small stone hearth. The air smelled of drying herbs and old books. Mason stood dripping on the welcome mat, feeling like a giant in the small, cozy space. "You knew," he said, his voice raw.
"You knew what was in that chest."
"You knew about my father." Evelyn nodded, pouring him a cup of hot tea with a steady hand. "I did. My family, we are not guardians like yours. We are watchers. For every Johnson who has guarded the Heartwood, a member of my line has been there to offer counsel, to preserve the lore, and to guide the new guardian when the time comes. It is our duty, as it is yours." She gestured for him to sit. "The blight you read about is an ancient, parasitic entity. It does not think as we do. It only consumes, turning life into decay, warmth into cold, and light into shadow. The Heartwood is its antithesis, a wellspring of pure life. For millennia, the two have been in balance. But the blight has grown bold. It has found a way to poison the land from afar, weakening the Heartwood's defenses before it makes its move to consume it entirely." Mason listened, his mind racing to absorb it all. "What do I do? The journal gives me history, but it doesn't tell me how to fight this." "The first step is not to fight, but to protect," Evelyn explained. "The blight's influence spreads like a fog, blinding and confusing. You cannot find the Heartwood while the forest is so deeply corrupted. You must first find the Sunstone." She retrieved an old, rolled-up piece of deer hide from a shelf and spread it on the table. It was a hand-drawn map of the Havenwood Forest, but with landmarks he'd never seen before: ancient monoliths, a forgotten river bend, a grove of petrified trees. "The Sunstone is an artifact of the first Guardians," she said, pointing to a crudely drawn symbol of a shining rock deep within the most remote part of the woods. "It does not create light, but it amplifies it, purifying its surroundings. It can burn away the blight's immediate influence, clearing the path and revealing the way forward. Your father's journal tells of the past. This map, and my knowledge, will guide your present." Mason stared at the map. The path to the Sunstone led through the Shadowfen, a marshy, treacherous part of the forest he had been warned to avoid his entire life. It was a place of local legend, where people were said to get lost for days, driven mad by strange sights and sounds. He looked up from the map, his eyes meeting Evelyn's. He saw no fear in them, only an unwavering faith. The path was dangerous, the enemy was an ancient force of nature, and his only weapon was a hammer he barely understood. Yet, for the first time, he did not feel alone. He had a guide. He had a purpose. "The storm is a shield for the blight's work," Evelyn said softly. "You must go now, while its power is still gathering. Follow the Whispering Creek until you reach the Standing Stones. They will point you toward the Shadowfen. Be brave, Mason Johnson. The fate of this valley now rests on your shoulders." Mason finished his tea, the warmth spreading through him and chasing away some of the chill. He nodded, his resolve hardening into steel. He rolled up the map and tucked it securely inside his jacket. With the hammer at his side and a new understanding of the world, he walked to the door. As he stepped back out into the night, the forest no longer seemed just hostile. It seemed like a challenge. His journey had truly begun. Leaving the warmth of Evelyn's cottage behind was like stepping into another world. The forest at night was a place of deep shadows and hushed sounds, but this was different. The air was heavy, charged with a palpable sense of malice that made the hairs on Mason's arms stand on end. With the deerskin map clutched in one hand and his other resting on the cool, solid handle of the hammer at his side, he began his journey. Evelyn's directions were his only guide. He found the Whispering Creek easily enough, though its name was now a cruel irony. The water, normally clear and lively, ran sluggish and black. Instead of a gentle babble, the sounds it made were like hoarse, gasping whispers that seemed to claw at the edges of his hearing. He pushed the unnerving sounds from his mind, focusing on the path, his boots sinking into the soft, rain-soaked earth with every step. The forest was unnaturally silent. There were no crickets, no rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. There was only the sound of his own breathing and the sinister murmur of the creek. After nearly an hour of walking, he saw them. Looming out of the mist ahead was a circle of standing stones, just as Evelyn had described. They were massive, ancient monoliths, covered in thick green moss and carved with runes that were unlike any script he had ever seen. They hummed with a dormant power, a sense of ages-old magic that made the air around them feel thick and heavy. As he stepped into the center of the circle, the hammer at his hip pulsed with a sudden warmth. The runes on the stones flickered in response, glowing with a soft, silver light. He realized the stones and the hammer were connected, two parts of an ancient design. He remembered Evelyn's words, "They will point you toward the Shadowfen." Looking closely, he saw that one of the glowing runes on the central stone was shaped like a serpent, its head pointing directly into a dense, fog-choked thicket of trees that seemed to swallow the very light around it.
That was his path.
Taking a deep breath to steady his nerves, he gave the stones a final, grateful look and plunged into the oppressive darkness of the Shadowfen. The change in atmosphere was immediate and suffocating. The air grew thick with the cloying stench of rot and decay. Twisted, skeletal trees with bare, grasping branches rose from stagnant, oil-black water. A thick, clammy fog clung to everything, reducing his visibility to mere feet and rendering the map almost useless. The whispers grew louder here, twisting into coherent words. Mason turned back. He froze. The voice was his mother's, a perfect imitation of her gentle, loving tone. It had been 6 years since he'd heard that voice. "This is not your fight," the voice cooed, seeming to come from all directions at once. "Come home. The forge is warm. You're safe there." He shook his head, his heart aching. "You're not real," he whispered, his voice trembling. He knew it was a trick, an illusion meant to prey on his grief. But it felt so real. He saw a flicker of movement in the fog, an image of his forge, firelight spilling from its open door, a perfect picture of warmth and safety. It was everything he wanted. As he hesitated, his resolve wavering, a gnarled root snaked out from the murky water and wrapped around his ankle, pulling him off balance. He cried out as he fell, his knee hitting a hard rock beneath the mud. The whispers intensified, now laced with his father's voice. "You are not strong enough, son. You will fail, just as I did." Despair, cold and sharp, pierced through him. He was just a blacksmith. What was he thinking? This was madness. He was going to die here, alone in this cursed swamp. As he struggled against the root's vice-like grip, his hand instinctively tightened around the handle of his hammer. The moment his fingers closed around the leather-wrapped yew, a surge of clean, grounding energy flowed up his arm. It was like a jolt of pure lightning, burning away the fog of despair and illusion in his mind. The hammer began to glow, its dark iron head emitting a steady, golden light that pushed back the oppressive darkness. The whispers shrieked and faded, and the image of his forge dissolved into mist. The root around his ankle withered into black dust and released him. He staggered to his feet, breathing heavily, his mind clear for the first time since entering the fun. The hammer's light cast long, dancing shadows around him, but it also provided a circle of safety, a small island of sanity in a sea of corruption. He now understood. The blight wasn't just a poison in the soil. It was an intelligent entity, a hunter that used fear and sorrow as its weapons. And his hammer was not just a tool. It was a shield for his mind and spirit as much as his body. With a newfound determination, Mason held the glowing hammer aloft like a torch. The light wasn't bright, but it was enough. It cut through the worst of the fog, revealing the treacherous path ahead. The shadowy figures that had been flitting at the edge of his vision recoiled from the light, retreating into the deeper darkness. The fight was far from over, but he was no longer just a lost boy wandering in the woods. He was a guardian, armed and aware, pushing through enemy territory. He pressed deeper into the marsh, following the faint trail that was now visible in the hammer's glow. He was exhausted, caked in mud, and his whole body ached, but his spirit was resolute. After what felt like an eternity, he reached a small, strangely solid island of earth in the center of the swamp. Ahead, the fog thinned, and he saw it, a sickly, pulsating green light emanating from the base of a gnarled, ancient willow tree. The air around it was visibly distorted, shimmering with a corrupt energy. The whispers were strongest here, a cacophony of fear and doubt. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he had found the heart of the Shadowfen's corruption. And somewhere within that venomous light, the Sunstone was waiting. Mason approached the ancient willow, his hammer held tight in a two-handed grip. The hammer's golden glow was his only shield against the suffocating presence of the blight. The sickly green light pulsed from a hollow at the tree's base, beating like a diseased heart. The ground here was cracked and barren, and the air was so thick with the stench of decay that he had to fight the urge to gag. The whispers were no longer subtle tricks. They were a direct, psychic assault, a torrent of his deepest fears and insecurities screaming in his mind. Failure. Weakling. You will be forgotten. Everyone you love will perish because of you. He gritted his teeth, focusing on the steady, grounding warmth of the hammer. As he drew closer, he could finally see the source of the malevolent light. Inside the hollow, nestled amongst a web of blackened roots, was a stone. But it was not the sunstone Evelyn had described. This stone was a jagged shard of obsidian-like rock, pulsing with a venomous green light. It was a cancer in the heart of the marsh, a blightstone, and it was actively poisoning everything around it. The sunstone was nowhere in sight. A cold dread washed over him. Had he come all this way for nothing? Or worse, was the sunstone already consumed, destroyed by this dark artifact? He knew he couldn't leave this blightstone here. Its destruction was the only path forward. Raising the heavy iron hammer over his shoulder, he prepared to strike, channeling all his strength into the blow. But as he swung, the swamp itself seemed to rise up to defend its corrupt heart. The bubbling mud and tangled roots at the base of the willow churned violently. With a sickening, tearing sound, a monstrous form pulled itself from the mire. It was a hulking creature, easily twice Mason's height, a shambling parody of a man forged from black mud, twisted branches, and the decaying bones of animals that had been lost to the fun. 2 points of green light burned deep within its head like hateful eyes, and it let out a low, guttural roar that was the sound of snapping trees and shifting graves. This was the Blight's guardian. For a moment, Mason was frozen by pure, primal terror. This wasn't an illusion. This was a physical threat, a monster intent on tearing him apart. He was a blacksmith, not a warrior. The creature swung a massive arm made of thick, interwoven roots. Mason barely managed to dive aside, stumbling and falling into the mud as the blow crashed down where he had been standing, shaking the very ground. Scrambling backward, he swung his hammer at the creature's leg. The iron had connected with a wet, squelching thud, sinking into the mud and slime of its body, but doing no real damage. The monster didn't even seem to notice. It backhanded him with tremendous force, sending him flying through the air. He landed hard, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. Pain flared in his ribs. The creature lumbered toward him, its shadowy form blocking out the hammer's faint light. It raised both of its massive arms, preparing to bring them down for a final, crushing blow. Pinned, terrified, and gasping for breath, Mason's mind went strangely quiet. All the whispers of the blight, all his own doubts, faded away. There was only this moment, this one final chance. He thought of his father's journal, of the generations of guardians who came before him. He thought of the sick townsfolk in Havenwood, of Evelyn's trusting eyes. He was not going to die here. He wasn't just holding the hammer anymore. He was connected to it. He didn't just swing it with his arms. He poured his will into it, his desperation, his fierce desire to protect his home. He focused all of his resolve into the iron head of the weapon. "Be gone," he roared, his voice raw. As he spoke the words, the hammer exploded with a blinding, golden light. It was no longer just a warm glow, but a radiant sunburst of pure energy. He swung upwards from the ground with all his might. This time, the impact was not a dull thud. It was a thunderous boom. A wave of purifying power erupted from the point of contact, a visible shockwave of golden light. The blight-forged creature shrieked, a sound of pure agony, as the holy energy disintegrated the dark magic that gave it form. The mud, roots, and bone that composed its body were blasted apart, crumbling into dust and dissolving back into the now cleansed earth. Mason lay on his back, chest heaving, his body screaming in protest. The silence was profound. The oppressive weight in the air was gone. The venomous green pulse from the Blightstone had flickered and died. The whispers in his head were silent. He had won. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his feet. As the last of the green light faded from the dead Blightstone, a new light began to shine from within the same hollow. It was soft and warm, a gentle golden radiance that felt like the first rays of dawn after a long night. He limped to the ancient willow and peered inside. There, tucked in a hidden crevice behind the now inert Blightstone, was a smooth, perfectly round river stone. It glowed with an inner light, radiating a warmth that was the very essence of life and health. This was the Sunstone. With a trembling hand, he reached in and lifted it. The stone was warm to the touch and pulsed with a gentle, steady rhythm, like a sleeping heartbeat. As his fingers closed around it, the stone's light flared. A wave of cleansing energy, far more powerful than what the hammer had produced, washed out from him in all directions. The black, stagnant water of the Fund began to clear. The oppressive fog lifted and dissipated, revealing the first stars he had seen all night. The twisted, skeletal trees seemed to straighten, and the air filled with the clean scent of damp earth and living plants. He had not only survived his first battle, but he had taken the first true step in healing the land. The warm, golden light of the Sunstone pulsed gently in Mason's hand, a stark and beautiful contrast to the memory of the Blightstone's venomous green glare. All around him, the Shadowfen was transforming. The oppressive fog had vanished completely, replaced by the cool, clean air of a forest after a storm. The stagnant black water now flowed with a gentle current, its surface reflecting the newly visible stars above. He even saw a single, green leaf unfurl on a branch of the ancient willow, a small but powerful symbol of life's resilience. Exhaustion settled deep into his bones, and every muscle ached from the fight. He sank to the ground, his back against the willow's trunk, and examined his prize. The Sunstone was smooth and unassuming, yet it held a power that was the antithesis of the dark magic he had just faced. Its warmth seeped into his skin, a soothing balm that eased the pain in his ribs and mended the scrapes on his arms. It wasn't just healing his body, it was restoring his spirit, filling the spaces that fear had carved out with a quiet, steady courage. He looked from the stone in his hand to the hammer resting beside him. He had won. He, Mason Johnson, a blacksmith who had never been in a real fight in his life, had faced a monster and won. Awe mingled with his relief. The power hadn't come from his muscles alone. It had come from his will, a desperate, focused intent that had turned the hammer from a simple tool into a conduit for something pure and ancient. He was beginning to understand. The strength of a guardian wasn't just about swinging a hammer, it was about the conviction behind the swing. After a few minutes of rest, knowing he couldn't stay, he pulled out the deerskin map Evelyn had given him. As he unrolled the ancient parchment, the light from the Sunstone spilled across its surface. He gasped. The map was changing before his eyes. Faint, golden lines, previously invisible, began to trace themselves across the hide. They formed a new path, a glowing trail that started at his exact location in the center of the Shadowfen and wound its way deep into the most remote, uncharted parts of the Havenwood Forest. The Sunstone wasn't just a purifier. It was a compass, a key designed to reveal the hidden ways of the forest to the Guardians. A renewed sense of purpose surged through him. He carefully placed the still-glowing Sunstone into a small leather pouch at his belt. Its light was muted, but its warmth remained, a constant, reassuring presence. With one last look at the now peaceful marsh, he turned and followed the start of the glowing path on his map. The journey was different now. The forest, under the subtle influence of the Sunstone he carried, felt less hostile. The oppressive silence was broken by the gentle chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. Life was returning to the woods. Yet, he could still feel the Blight's presence lingering at the edges of the stone's aura, a persistent chill just beyond the circle of its warmth. It was a stark reminder that his victory in the Fun was just one battle in a much larger war. The heart of the sickness was still out there, spreading. The glowing path on the map led him upward, along winding trails he never knew existed toward a high ridge that overlooked the northern valley. As he reached the summit, he paused to catch his breath. The view was vast and breathtaking under the starry sky, but it was not the beauty that captured his attention. Far below, in a distant part of the valley, a section of the forest was unnaturally dark, a spreading stain of death that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Even from this distance, he could see that the trees there were black and skeletal, the ground barren and lifeless. It was a wound in the heart of the world. As he stared in horror at the creeping desolation, he saw movement. At the edge of the decay, shadowy figures moved with a chilling purpose. They were not mindless, shambling creatures like the Fin monster. They were humanoid in shape, moving in organized groups, their forms flickering and insubstantial, as if they were woven from shadow and malice. They seemed to be tending to the decay, encouraging its spread, their dark energies poisoning everything they touched. Mason dropped to a crouch behind a rocky outcropping, his heart pounding. These were the true agents of the Blight. Not just a mindless force of nature, but a conscious, intelligent enemy with soldiers and a goal. He was not just fighting a sickness, he was fighting an army. The small victory in the Shadowfen suddenly felt insignificant in the face of this vast, creeping darkness. He looked from the blighted valley below to the warm, gentle glow emanating from the pouch at his belt. The Sunstone had shown him the path, but it had also revealed the terrifying scale of the war he was now a part of. He was one man against a force that could swallow entire forests. Clutching the warm stone, a new, harder resolve settled over him. Fear was a luxury he could no longer afford. The path was clear, and for the sake of his home, he would walk it to the end. A cold resolve settled over Mason as he watched the shadowy army from the ridge. The sight was terrifying, a clear picture of the overwhelming odds he faced. But seeing the enemy, giving his fear a form, also gave him focus. He was not a soldier, and he knew a direct confrontation would be suicide. The path revealed by the Sunstone did not lead him down into that valley of death. It guided him along the high ridge, skirting the edge of the corruption. He had to trust the path. He had to trust the wisdom of those who had walked it before him. He descended from the windswept peak, following the faint, golden trail on the map that only he could see. The journey took him away from the blighted lands and deeper into a part of the forest that felt ancient, primal, and strangely untouched. The trees here were larger than any he had ever seen, their trunks thick as houses and their tops lost in the canopy of stars. The air grew still and heavy, not with malice, but with a profound and reverent silence, as if he were stepping into a natural cathedral. The path eventually opened into a clearing, and what he saw made him stop in his tracks. It was a grove of redwood trees, but they were unlike any living thing. They were completely petrified, turned to gray stone by the passage of uncountable years. They stood like silent, colossal statues, their stony bark covered in patches of phosphorescent moss that cast a soft, silvery light on the grove. This was a sacred place, a place outside of time. As he stepped into the grove, the sunstone in his pouch began to glow more brightly, its warm light mingling with the cool silver of the moss. Drawn by an unseen force, Mason approached the largest of the petrified giants, a tree so massive it defied imagination. He reached out and placed his hand flat against its cold, stone-like surface. The moment his skin made contact, a powerful energy surged through him. The sunstone at his hip flared with light, and the hammer at his side hummed with a deep, resonant frequency. The world around him dissolved into a swirl of light and sound. He was no longer in the petrified grove. The trees were alive, their bark a rich, reddish-brown, and the air was filled with the scent of pine and living earth. He was seeing through someone else's eyes. He looked down and saw his own hands, but they were not his. They were clad in the same ancient leather bracers, and they were holding the same iron hammer. He was seeing a memory, an echo of a past guardian. He felt the man's weary strength, his deep connection to the forest, and an unwavering sense of duty that was so familiar it felt like his own. The guardian, his ancestor, was not fighting. He was performing a ritual, murmuring ancient words as he channeled a stream of his own energy into the great tree. As the vision continued, a single, clear thought resonated through Mason's mind, a message from the past spoken not in words, but in pure feeling. The forest remembers. A guardian's spirit never truly fades. We are the stone. We are the wood. We are always here. The vision shattered, and Mason stumbled back, gasping, his own hand still pressed against the cold, petrified bark. He was back in the present, but everything had changed. He understood now. This grove was a sanctuary, a library of memories where the spirits and experiences of past guardians were preserved within the ancient trees. He was not alone. The strength, the knowledge, and the resolve of his entire bloodline were here, accessible to him. His legacy was not just a burden, it was his greatest source of power. Shaken but filled with a new sense of belonging, he looked more closely at the base of the great tree. In the vision, he had seen his ancestor glance at a set of runes carved into the stone. He knelt down, and in the combined light of the sunstone and the glowing moss, he found them. They were deeply etched into the petrified wood. As he focused on them, a specific symbol, one he recognized from a drawing in his father's journal, began to glow with a faint, golden light. It was the symbol for threshold or sanctuary. The map had led him here for more than just a history lesson. It had brought him here to receive a key, a confirmation that he was on the right path to the Heartwood itself. This grove was the gateway. With a sense of reverence he had never known, Mason placed his hand back on the tree. He closed his eyes, no longer feeling just the cold stone, but a faint, reassuring hum from deep within, the collected spirits of his family. He felt his father's presence, his grandfather's, and countless others stretching back into the mists of time. They had all stood here. They had all felt this fear and this resolve. And they had all walked the path that lay before him. The journey ahead was still fraught with peril, but the feeling of isolation that had haunted him was gone. He was the living vessel of a legacy that had guarded Havenwood for centuries. He was a link in an unbroken chain, and he would not be the one to let it break. Leaving the Grove of Echoes felt like waking from a dream. The profound connection to his ancestors faded to a quiet hum in the back of his mind, a source of steady strength rather than an overwhelming presence. He was still just Mason, a blacksmith far from home, but the crushing weight of solitude was gone. He was walking a path his own blood had paved for him. The golden trail on his map led him out of the ancient grove and into a narrow, winding canyon. The rock walls on either side rose steeply, seeming to scrape the very stars from the sky. As he ventured deeper, he noticed the walls were not natural stone. They were covered in intricate carvings and the same ancient runes he'd seen in the grove. This was not a random pass through the mountains. It was a deliberate, man-made or magically forged path, an entryway. The air grew thick with a dormant, immense power, a feeling of sanctity that made the Grove of Echoes feel like a mere antechamber. The canyon finally ended, not in an opening, but in a sheer, seamless wall of granite that stretched from one side of the pass to the other. It was a dead end, but in the center of the wall, carved 50 feet high, was the glowing symbol he now knew meant threshold. This was the final gate, the entrance to the Heartwood's hidden sanctuary. There was no handle, no seam, no keyhole. As Mason cautiously approached, the massive rune flared with a brilliant white light. A voice, ancient and powerful, echoed not in the canyon, but directly inside his mind. It was a voice that sounded like grinding stone and shifting continents, a being of immense age and neutrality. "You carry the tools of the Guardian," the voice intoned, its tone neither friendly nor hostile. "You have walked the hidden path, but the blight grows stronger, and the Heartwood's defenses are failing. The tools alone are not enough. I am the threshold. I am the final ward. Many have come to this gate. All have been tested. Prove your worth." Mason's hand rested on his hammer. He was ready for a fight, another monster to defeat. "I am ready," he said, his voice sounding small in the vast canyon. "Brute force will not unmake this stone," the voice replied, as if reading his thoughts. "Your strength is temporary. Your weapon is but iron and wood. I have stood against the shadow for millennia. I have felt the earth shake and have seen mountains turn to dust. Tell me, son of Aaron, what power do you possess that can withstand the coming darkness? What makes a guardian worthy?" It was a riddle, a trial of the mind, not of the body. Mason thought for a moment, his mind racing. What was his greatest power? "I carry the strength of my ancestors," he answered, thinking of the vision in the grove. "The hammer of my father and his father before him." The rune on the gate dimmed slightly. "The past is a memory," the voice said, a hint of disappointment in its tone. "It is a foundation, not a fortress. The strength of the dead cannot save the living. Try again." A knot of anxiety tightened in Mason's stomach. He thought of his victory in the fun. "I have the power to destroy the Blight," he said, more forcefully. "I defeated its servant in the Shadowfen. I will destroy its armies." The gate remained impassive. "Destruction is a cycle," the ancient voice countered. "You destroy the shadow, and it returns. You cut down the weed, and it regrows from the poisoned soil. To fight is necessary, but it is not a solution. It is not the core of a guardian's worth. You have one final chance." Defeated, Mason sagged against the canyon wall. He had failed. He had come all this way, faced monsters and his own fears, only to be stopped by a riddle he couldn't answer. What else was there? Strength and the will to fight were all he had. He looked down at the pouch at his belt. The sunstone emitted its gentle, warm light. He remembered its effect on the Shadowfen. It hadn't just destroyed the Blight's influence, it had cleansed the water, healed the land, and allowed life to return. His gaze fell upon his own calloused hands. For years, they had not been weapons. They had been tools of creation. He didn't just smash iron. He shaped it, forged it, gave it purpose. He built plows that brought forth life from the soil. He crafted hinges that allowed doors to open, to welcome people in. He wasn't a destroyer. He was a builder. The answer, when it came, was so simple and so clear he almost laughed. He had been thinking like a warrior, but that wasn't who he was. That wasn't what the world needed. He stood up, walked back to the center of the gate, and placed his palm flat against the cold stone over the rune. He closed his eyes, not trying to be a hero or a warrior, but just Mason. He didn't speak to the voice in his head, but to the gate itself. "My true power isn't the strength to destroy," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "It's the will to rebuild. It's not the ability to fight the darkness, but the determination to protect the light. It's the blacksmith's promise to mend what is broken. The farmer's faith to plant a seed in barren ground. It's hope." As the word, hope, left his lips, the canyon filled with a blinding golden light. The sunstone flared, and the hammer at his side vibrated with a powerful, joyful energy. The massive threshold rune on the wall shone like a star, and the solid rock before him dissolved, line by line, into an archway of shimmering, pure light. The ancient voice spoke one last time, and for the first time, Mason detected a hint of warmth, of approval. "Hope is the seed of the new dawn. It is the one thing the Blight cannot consume. You are worthy. Pass, Guardian." Mason stood at the precipice, looking into the swirling portal of light. He had faced the ghosts of his past and the monsters of the present. He had been tested, and he had not been found wanting. Taking a deep breath, he stepped through the gate and into the sanctuary of the Heartwood. Stepping through the shimmering portal was like diving into a cool, clear lake. For a weightless moment, all sound and sensation vanished, replaced by a rushing feeling of pure, untainted life energy. Then, his boots touched solid ground, and the world resolved around him. The air that filled his lungs was so clean and sweet it felt like his first breath. The oppressive weight of the Blight, a burden he had grown so accustomed to he barely noticed it anymore, was completely gone. He stood in a place of impossible beauty. He was in a subterranean cavern so vast that he could not see the walls or ceiling, which were lost in a soft, silvery mist. The space was not dark. It was filled with a gentle, multi-hued twilight. The light emanated from everything, from thick carpets of glowing moss on the cavern floor, from clusters of luminous, bell-shaped fungi, and from strange, beautiful flowers whose petals pulsed with a soft, internal light. A crystal-clear stream wound its way through the sanctuary, its water chiming like tiny bells as it flowed over glowing pebbles. This was the Heartwood Sanctuary, a bastion of life hidden from the world's decay. In the center of the cavern, the source of all its light and life, stood the Heartwood itself. To call it a tree was a profound understatement. It was a colossal, ancient being, its trunk wider than his forge and home combined, soaring up into the misty heights. Its bark was not wood but a fusion of living timber and crystalline light, and its massive branches were draped with leaves of pure gold and silver. A gentle, rhythmic pulse of golden white light emanated from its core, a slow, powerful heartbeat that resonated through the very stone beneath his feet. He was standing at the heart of the world, and he was completely awestruck. But as his eyes traced the magnificent form of the tree, a knot of dread formed in his stomach. The sanctuary was not untouched. On the side of the great tree, a dark, creeping sickness marred its perfection. It looked like a spreading cancer, a network of black, thorny vines that dug into the luminous bark, slowly choking the life from it. Where the blight's corruption took hold, the heartwood's light was dim and sputtering, and a low, mournful hum, a vibration of pure pain, resonated from the afflicted area. "It is dying," a voice said, soft and resonant, like the rustling of 1,000 leaves. Mason spun around, his hand flying to his hammer. A figure emerged from behind a cluster of glowing crystals. It was humanoid in shape, but clearly not human. Its body was formed of living, interwoven wood and vines, its skin like the bark of a young birch tree. A mane of green leaves served as its hair, and its eyes glowed with the warm, ancient light of amber. It was a sylvan, a spirit of the forest made manifest. "Peace, Guardian," the creature said, raising a hand made of twigs and branches. "Your weapon is not needed here. I am Silas. I am the caretaker of this place, and I have been waiting for you." Mason slowly lowered his hammer, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "You knew I was coming? The heartwood has been calling for its guardian since the first thorn pierced its skin," Silas explained, his amber eyes fixed on the dark patch on the great tree. "The blight is more clever than it has been in past ages. It could not assault this sanctuary directly, so it planted a seed of its own essence, a thorn of despair, into the heartwood's outer layers. It is a splinter of pure malice, poisoning the heartwood from within and providing an anchor for the greater corruption to take hold." Silas glided closer to the tree, his leafy feet making no sound on the mossy ground. "The natural defenses of this place and my own power can slow the spread of the poison, but we cannot remove the thorn. It is an artifact of pure despair, and it consumes the life force of any magical being that touches it. It can only be undone by a mortal, one whose spirit is not made of the same magic the blight feeds on. It requires a mortal's hope, channeled through a guardian's tools." Mason followed the sylvan's gaze to the pulsating, dark wound on the tree. The task, terrifying and immense, was suddenly crystal clear. All his journeying, all the trials in the swamp and at the gate, had led to this single moment. He wasn't here to fight an army in the woods. He was here to perform surgery on the very soul of the forest. He stood before the weeping, corrupted section of the magnificent heartwood. He could feel its ancient, immense pain as if it were his own. Silas stood beside him, a solemn, ancient ally. The fate of Havenwood, and perhaps the entire land, rested not on a battlefield, but here, in this sacred, hidden place. He finally understood the full weight of his duty. He took the sunstone from its pouch, its warm light a comforting presence, and gripped his hammer, its iron head seeming to hum in anticipation. The real battle was about to begin. Mason took a steadying breath and stepped toward the afflicted heartwood. With each step closer to the dark wound, the air grew colder, and the serene peace of the sanctuary was replaced by a suffocating pressure. The whispers started again. They had been absent since he entered the cavern, but now they returned with a vicious, intimate familiarity. They were no longer the vague, mocking tones from the Fun, but targeted, personal assaults that struck at the core of his identity. A blacksmith playing hero. A voice hissed, sounding chillingly like his own self-doubt. "What can your clumsy hands do but break things? You let your father down. Now you will let everyone down." He saw fleeting, horrifying images in his mind's eye. The people of Havenwood, their faces gaunt and pale, accusing him, Evelyn, her eyes filled with bitter disappointment, his father, turning away from him in shame. He held the sunstone aloft. Its warm, golden light flared, pushing back against the encroaching despair and creating a small, sanctified circle of calm around him. From the edge of the corruption, Silas watched, his amber eyes filled with concern. "It will show you what you fear most, Guardian," the Sylvan called out, his voice like the rustling of leaves in a storm. "The thorn feeds on despair. Do not let it take root in your heart." Mason reached the trunk. The black, thorny vines writhed like living serpents, guarding the source of the infection. At the center of the blighted patch, he saw it clearly now. The thorn of despair. It was a jagged, ugly shard of solidified shadow, about the length of his forearm, driven deep into the heartwood's luminous flesh. It seemed to absorb the light around it, a miniature black hole of pure malice. He ignored the whispers, focusing his anger and determination. He raised his hammer and brought it down with all his might on the thickest cluster of vines. The impact resulted in a shower of acrid black sparks, and a jarring shockwave ran up his arms. For a moment, he had cleared a path, but before he could strike again, the vines regrow with unnatural speed, thicker, sharper, and more numerous than before. The psychic assault intensified tenfold. Failure, the voices screamed in a deafening chorus. He staggered back, clutching his head. The hammer suddenly felt impossibly heavy in his grip, its weight not of iron, but of his own inadequacy. His hope, the very thing that had opened the threshold, was beginning to waver. How could he fight something that grew stronger from his own efforts to defeat it? He was being overwhelmed. The whispers were breaking through his defenses, turning his memories into weapons against him. He was losing. On his knees, with the thorns slowly beginning to creep toward the edge of the sunstone's light, he felt a tear of frustration and despair trace a path through the grime on his cheek. It was then, at his lowest point, that his gaze fell upon the sunstone clutched in his other hand. Its gentle, unwavering light. He remembered the feeling of life returning to the Shadowfen, a quiet miracle in a poisoned land. He thought of the grove of echoes, of the silent promise he'd felt from his ancestors. And then he thought of home, not as some grand kingdom to be saved, but in small, clear pictures. He thought of the smell of baking bread from the miller's wife. He thought of the sound of children laughing in the town square. He thought of Mr. Henderson, a good man who was worried about his prize stallion. This wasn't about a grand destiny. It wasn't about being a mythical hero. It was about protecting his home. It was about mending what was broken. That was the core of a blacksmith. That was the core of him. The clarity of that simple, honest purpose became a shield more powerful than any anger or brute force. The whispers lost their edge, their power to wound him. He was not a failure. He was a son, a neighbor, and a craftsman, and he would not let his home fall to ruin. He knew what he had to do. Brute force was feeding the thorns. He had to fight darkness with pure light. Pushing himself to his feet, he took the brightly glowing sunstone and pressed it firmly against the flat face of his iron hammer. The two artifacts, born of ancient magic, one representing hope and the other representing the will to protect, met with a resonant chime. An explosive, blindingly brilliant white gold light erupted from the point of their union. It was the pure, concentrated essence of hope made manifest, a light so intense it didn't just illuminate, it purified. The screaming whispers were instantly vaporized, replaced by a profound, holy silence. Mason, his face grim with determination and shielded by this incandescent power, strode forward. The writhing thorns recoiled, sizzling and turning to ash wherever the light touched them. He was no longer just a man holding a tool. He was the focal point for a power the Blight could not comprehend. He raised the empowered hammer high above his head. For a heartbeat, he was a living conduit of dawn's first light. With a roar that came from the very depths of his soul, he brought the hammer down, aiming not at the vines, but at the heart of the rod itself, the thorn of despair. The moment of impact was silent, yet the cavern was filled with a soundless concussion. A shockwave of pure, cleansing energy erupted from the hammer, a rapidly expanding sphere of white gold light that engulfed the entire corrupted section of the heartwood. The wave of white gold energy washed over Mason, through him, and into the very foundations of the cavern. It was a silent, holy explosion that carried no heat or force, only an overwhelming sense of purification, like a fever breaking. For a long moment, he was blinded, his entire world a canvas of searing, beautiful light. Then, as quickly as it came, the light receded. A profound silence settled over the sanctuary, broken only by the gentle chiming of the nearby stream. Mason's arms trembled with exhaustion, and he lowered the heavy hammer, its head no longer glowing with borrowed power. The sunstone, resting on the floor where he dropped it, returned to its gentle, warm pulse. He looked up, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. The thorn of despair was gone, vaporized. The writhing, black vines that had choked the heartwood had been reduced to fine gray ash, which was now flaking away from the luminous bark and dissolving into the mossy ground. The cold, oppressive aura of the Blight had been completely purged from this sacred place. Relief, so potent it almost brought him to his knees, flooded through him. He had done it, but as the last of the ash fell away, his triumph soured. The Blight was gone, but it had left its mark. A deep, ugly gash of dark, lifeless wood marred the heartwood's otherwise perfect trunk. It was a scar, raw and grievous, a testament to the violation the tree had suffered. Around the wound, the heartwood's rhythmic, internal light was still weak, fluttering like a candle in the wind. He had removed the poison, but the injury remained. Silas glided to his side, the Sylvan's amber eyes filled with a deep, ancient sorrow that was mingled with immense gratitude. He placed a gentle, bark-like hand on Mason's shoulder. "You have done what generations of my kind could not," he said, his voice soft. "You have given the Heartwood a chance to fight. But the wound..." Mason began, a feeling of failure creeping back in. I expected it would heal. Some wounds run too deep to be erased in a moment, even for a being as powerful as this, Silas explained wisely. The Blight's touch is the essence of anti-life. It does not just injure, it negates. Your act of courage did more than just destroy the thorn. In its place, you have planted a seed of your own hope deep within the scar. That seed will allow the Heartwood to begin healing itself from within, but the process will be slow. It will take many seasons for the light to reclaim the darkness. The Sylvan turned his gaze toward the shimmering portal of the threshold. And its healing is not assured. Destroying the thorn was the most vital step, but it was only the beginning. The thorn was but an anchor, a symptom of the greater disease that still festers in the world outside. Mason followed his gaze, a grim understanding dawning on him. "The army of shadows I saw from the ridge." "Precisely," Silas affirmed. "The Blight's true power is still gathering in your forest, poisoning the land and marshaling its forces. As long as it grows unchecked, it will continue to batter against the defenses of the sanctuary. The Heartwood, in its weakened state, cannot heal fully while under constant assault. The scar will remain a vulnerability, a weakness the Blight will seek to exploit." The nature of his quest shifted in that moment. He hadn't come here to win a single, decisive battle. He had come to earn the right to fight the war. His duty was not just to find the Heartwood, but to defend it. "I have to go back," Mason said, his voice firm. "Yes, Guardian," Silas agreed. "You must sever the connection. You must weaken the Blight at its source, so the Heartwood has the time it needs to recover its strength." As he spoke, a single, luminous leaf of pure gold detached from a high branch of the Heartwood. It floated down through the soft light of the cavern, spiraling gently before landing in Mason's open palm. It was light as air, but radiated a potent, life-giving warmth. "A gift," Silas said with reverence. "A leaf of the Heartwood. It holds a small piece of the tree's pure life essence. It can grant a powerful burst of healing or purification when you are in greatest need. But its power is absolute and singular. You may use it only once. A final blessing for the dark road ahead." Mason closed his hand around the leaf, its warmth a comforting promise. He stood once more before the shimmering gateway, preparing to return to the blighted forest. He glanced back at the magnificent, wounded tree, its scar a stark reminder of what he was fighting for. He had won the battle for the heart. Now he had to win the war for the body. His quest was far from over. It had just begun. Stepping back through the portal was a physical shock. One moment, Mason was bathed in the warm, life-affirming energy of the Heartwood sanctuary. The next, he was standing in the cold, dead air of the stone canyon. The transition was jarring, like being plunged from a warm bed into a frozen lake. The profound peace of the sanctuary vanished, instantly replaced by the familiar, low-grade dread of the Blight's presence, a constant, oppressive weight on the world. The threshold gate shimmered behind him and solidified back into a seamless wall of granite, leaving him alone in the oppressive silence. He began the long journey back, retracing his steps through the ancient parts of the forest. The deerskin map was just a map again. The golden path that had guided him to the sanctuary was gone. The Sunstone's purpose had been fulfilled, and now he had to rely on his own memory and skill as a woodsman. He noticed the change almost immediately. In the time he had spent in the sanctuary, a period that felt like mere hours but could have been longer, the Blight's influence had spread with terrifying speed. The forest was darker, the shadows deeper and more menacing. A profound and unnatural chill hung in the air, the kind of biting cold that heralded a deep winter, not the gentle coolness of autumn. The few signs of life that had returned after he cleansed the Shadowfen were gone. The woods were once again deathly quiet. As he walked, he saw disturbing signs of a spreading corruption. A familiar gray squirrel scurried up a tree, but its eyes glowed with a faint, sickly green light, and its movements were jerky and unnatural. Later, he saw a majestic buck, a creature he recognized from the woods near his home, but its antlers were blackened and twisted, and it stared at him with an unnerving, vacant intelligence before melting back into the shadows. The blight was not just killing the land, it was twisting and perverting the life within it. His path eventually led him to the forested hills overlooking the town's logging camp. He expected to hear the familiar sounds of axes and saws, the shouts of working men. Instead, an eerie silence hung over the area. He cautiously made his way down and found the loggers, men he had known his entire life, huddled around a small, smoky fire, their faces pale and their eyes darting nervously toward the woods. Their axes and saws lay unused. One of the men, a burly, bearded logger named Ben with whom Mason had shared many a drink, spotted him emerging from the tree-line. Ben's face, normally quick to smile, hardened with suspicion. "Mason, by the saints, is that you? We thought you were dead or gone." Mason gave a weary nod.
Ben.
"What's going on? Why aren't you working?" Ben spat into the fire, his gaze distrustful. "Everything's gotten worse since you vanished, blacksmith. Much worse. The sickness is in town now. Old Man Hemlock's boy is down with it. The fog, a strange, cold fog rolls in from these woods every night. Brings nightmares. People are getting scared, angry, starting to blame each other." He looked Mason up and down, caked in mud and grime, carrying a strange, archaic hammer and appearing out of the deepest, most feared part of the woods. "Where in the hell have you been? Some are saying you were mixed up in all this strangeness, that you ran off 'cause you knew something." The words hit Mason like a physical blow. He looked at the faces of the other men. He saw no welcome, only fear and accusation.
He was a stranger to them now.
How could he possibly explain his journey? That he'd been fighting monsters in a magic swamp and talking to a tree at the center of the world? They would think he was a madman, or worse, the cause of their misfortune. The cold reality of his situation settled upon him. He could not go back to Havenwood. He was an outcast. To the townsfolk, he was now just another part of the terrifying mystery that was consuming their home. His fight had to be fought out here, in the shadows, alone. He gave a vague, non-committal answer, forcing a tired smile. "I was looking for rare roots, an old remedy my father wrote about. I thought it might help with the sickness." The explanation was weak, and he knew it. Ben just grunted, unconvinced. "Well, you won't find anything good in these woods anymore, Mason. Only trouble." Nodding, Mason began to back away. "Stay safe, Ben." He slipped back into the cover of the forest, the logger's suspicious eyes following him until he was gone. The warmth of the heartwood's leaf in his pocket felt a million miles away. He was not only fighting a creeping, ancient evil, but he now had to do it while being feared by the very people he had sworn to protect. The weight of the world felt heavier than ever. He had one last ally he could trust, one person who would understand. His course was clear. He had to find Evelyn. Mason moved through the woods of his childhood like a phantom. He kept to the deepest shadows, his steps silent on the carpet of dead leaves, his senses on high alert. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He was not just avoiding being seen by the townsfolk, he was actively hiding, an outcast in his own home. The forest he had once known as a place of solace was now enemy territory, and the unnatural cold seemed to seep into his very bones, a constant reminder of the growing power of the blight. When he finally saw the familiar, crooked chimney of Evelyn's cottage, a wave of relief washed over him. It was a tiny beacon of warmth and sanity in a world gone cold and mad. But as he drew closer, he noticed things were different. Small, intricate symbols, painted in what looked like white clay, adorned the doorframe and the edges of the windows. A thin, unbroken line of crushed white quartz, a stone known in folklore to repel evil, formed a perfect circle around the small house and its garden. The Blight's power was now so potent that even the Watcher, in her ancient wisdom, had been forced to erect wards against it. He knocked softly on the old wooden door. It opened almost instantly. Evelyn stood there, her face a mask of deep-set worry, but her eyes lit up with profound relief when she saw him. She wasted no words, grabbing his arm with a surprising strength and pulling him inside, quickly bolting the door behind him. "Thank the Ancient Ones," she breathed, her voice raspy. "I felt your return. The forest has grown so much colder since you left." The warmth from her small stone hearth was a welcome blessing. As she poured him a steaming mug of herbal tea, Mason recounted his entire story in a low, urgent voice. He spoke of the echoes of his ancestors in the petrified grove, the trial of hope at the threshold, and the impossible beauty of the Heartwood sanctuary. He described Silas the Sylvan, the terrifying battle with the thorn of despair, and the grievous scar it had left behind. He finished by telling her about the suspicious loggers and the bitter realization that he was now an outcast. As proof, he opened his palm and showed her the single, golden leaf from the Heartwood, which seemed to glow with its own inner warmth in the dim cottage. Evelyn listened without interruption, her gaze fixed on him, absorbing every word. When he was finished, she nodded slowly, a grim understanding on her face. "The scar explains the cold," she said softly. "The Heartwood is wounded, and its power to warm and protect the land is diminished. It is fighting to heal, but the blight presses its advantage." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "What you saw from the ridge is the true threat now. The blight is no longer just a creeping sickness. Its power has coalesced. It is raising an army. I call them the Hallowed, the lost spirits of animals and people who have perished in these woods, their forms twisted by the blight's malice and turned into its soldiers." Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside. "How do I fight an army, Evelyn?" "You do not fight the army," she replied, her voice firm. "You cut off its head. An army of shadows needs a shadow general. The blight has a focal point in this world, a powerful, corrupted being that channels its energy and commands the Hallowed." Silas was right. You must sever the connection. If you can find and destroy this general, the army of Hallowed will be left directionless, their power vastly diminished. "Where?" Mason asked, his hand tightening around his hammer. "Where do I find it?" Evelyn's gaze drifted toward the window, in the direction of the high, forbidding mountains. "There is a place of deep shadow and old wounds in these lands. The abandoned iron mine. Our ancestors dug too greedily, too deep, and disturbed something that should have been left to slumber. It has been a source of dark legends for generations. It is the perfect place for the blight to concentrate its power." The thought of facing a powerful general and its horde alone in a haunted mine was daunting. Sensing his thoughts, Evelyn offered a sliver of hope. "You may not have to face this entirely by yourself," she said. "There is another who lives on the fringes, another who has felt the blight's touch. His name is Caleb. He was once the town's finest hunter, but he lost his wife and daughter to a sudden sickness years ago, a sickness no one could explain. He has been half-wild ever since, hunting in the deepest parts of the woods, tracking things that are not natural. He is driven by vengeance, and he trusts no one. But he, more than anyone, might believe you if he sees the truth." She gave him directions to Caleb's remote cabin, a place even farther from town than her own. The path forward was now terrifyingly clear. First, he had to find a vengeful, half-wild hunter and somehow convince him to join his impossible quest. Then, they would have to journey to the haunted iron mine to confront a supernatural general and its army of shadows. Mason looked from the wise, determined face of the old watcher to the golden leaf resting on the table. He was still an outcast, still a blacksmith fighting a war of gods and monsters. But he was no longer aimless. He had a target. The final, desperate battle for Havenwood was drawing near. Mason left Evelyn's cottage under the cold light of a crescent moon, a clear and dangerous path now laid before him. He ventured deeper into the wilderness than he had ever gone before, pushing into the rugged, untamed lands that bordered the high mountains. Here, the blight's touch was not subtle. The corruption was raw and overt. Twisted trees clawed at the sky with bare, skeletal branches, and patches of the forest floor were covered in a black, slimy moss that seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light. The silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, no life. Only the whisper of the wind, which sounded unnervingly like a funeral dirge. After hours of navigating the hostile terrain, he found it exactly where Evelyn had described. It was less a home and more a fortress in miniature. The small, sturdy cabin was built into the side of a rocky hill, almost invisible from a distance. The perimeter was guarded by a ring of sharpened wooden stakes, and Mason could spot the telltale glint of tripwires connected to small, tarnished bells. This was the dwelling of a man who was constantly expecting a fight. This was Caleb's home. He moved cautiously, trying to find a clear path to the door, but his boots snagged a nearly invisible wire. A frantic, jarring jingle of bells shattered the silence. Before Mason could even react, an arrow hissed through the air, embedding itself deep into the tree trunk inches from his head with a solid thump. A figure melted out of the cabin's shadows, moving with the fluid, silent grace of a predator. He was lean and weathered, dressed in well-worn hunting leathers, his face framed by shaggy, dark hair. But it was his eyes that held Mason's attention. They were the eyes of a wolf, sharp and piercing, and they burned with a grief so profound it had curdled into a permanent, simmering rage. He held a masterfully crafted longbow with another arrow already nocked and aimed squarely at Mason's chest. This was Caleb. "You're a long way from the smell of coal smoke, blacksmith," Caleb growled, his voice rough from disuse. "You have 10 seconds to tell me why you're on my land before this arrow finds your heart." Mason held his hands up slowly, showing they were empty. "My name is Mason Johnson. Evelyn sent me." Caleb's expression didn't soften. The old woman knows better than to send people here. That's not an answer. Mason knew the full story would sound like the ravings of a lunatic. He had to start with the truth Caleb already knew. "I'm here because of the sickness," he said, his voice steady. "The unnatural cold. The animals that are no longer animals. I know what's causing it, and I'm here to stop it." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped Caleb's lips. "Stop it? I've been fighting it for 5 years, blacksmith. I've been putting down the things you've only just started to see. It can't be stopped. It can only be survived." He gestured dismissively with his bow. "Go home to your forge. This is no place for you." Caleb was about to turn away when a low snarl echoed from the dark woods behind Mason. They both froze. A pack of wolves emerged from the treeline, but they were horribly changed. Their fur was matted and patchy, their bodies unnaturally gaunt, and their eyes glowed with the same venomous green light Mason had seen in the fun. A shadowy mist seemed to cling to their forms. Hollowed, Caleb breathed, his dismissive anger instantly replaced by a hunter's lethal focus. Without another word, he unleashed an arrow. It flew true, striking one of the creatures in the shoulder. A normal wolf would have been crippled, but this one merely shook its head, a wisp of shadow smoking from the wound, and continued its advance. Mason didn't hesitate. While Caleb fired another 2 arrows in quick succession, buying them a precious few seconds, Mason charged forward, his hammer in hand. The lead wolf lunged at him, its jaws snapping. Mason swung the hammer in a heavy, desperate arc. The moment the iron head connected with the creature, a flash of clean, white light erupted from the point of impact. The hollowed wolf didn't yelp or fly back. It simply dissolved, its form unraveling into a cloud of black dust that was instantly scattered by the wind. The other wolves faltered, seemingly confused by the display of power. Caleb stared, his bow half-drawn, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had been fighting these things for years, whittling them down with arrows, barely surviving some encounters. He had never seen one destroyed so completely, so effortlessly. Seizing the moment, Mason struck again, obliterating another wolf. As the last one turned to flee, Caleb's hunter instincts took over, and he sent a final arrow straight through its head. Like the others, it dissolved into nothing. A tense silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the 2 men's ragged breaths. Caleb slowly lowered his bow, his gaze locked on the hammer in Mason's hand, then on the faint, warm glow emanating from the sunstone pouch at his belt. The pieces were clicking into place. The blacksmith's insane story, the impossible power of his weapon, the light that repelled the darkness. The burning rage in Caleb's eyes was still there, but now, for the first time in years, it was mingled with a fragile, unfamiliar flicker of something else. Hope. "All right, blacksmith," Caleb said, his voice still a low growl, but the immediate threat was gone. "You have my attention. Get inside, and start talking from the very beginning." Caleb's cabin was a testament to a life stripped down to its barest essentials, survival and vengeance. There were no comforts, only practicalities. A bedroll in the corner, a small hearth for warmth and cooking, and tools for maintaining his gear. The walls were covered with hand-drawn maps of the wilderness, marked with strange symbols that Mason didn't recognize. Cured pelts of animals, some unnaturally large or disfigured, were stacked in a corner. This was not a home. It was a hunter's den, a frontline outpost in a secret, lonely war. As the small fire crackled between them, Mason told a story. He left nothing out, the words spilling out of him with an urgency he hadn't realized he possessed. He spoke of the strange storm and Evelyn's warning, the legacy in his father's chest, the living nightmares of the Shadowfen, and the cleansing light of the Sunstone. He described the profound peace of the Grove of Echoes, the riddle at the threshold, and the heartbreaking sight of the wounded Heartwood. He explained his new mission, to find and destroy the Blight's general in the old iron mine. Caleb listened with an unnerving stillness, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He didn't interrupt. He just watched Mason, his piercing eyes seeming to peel back the layers of the story, searching for any hint of deception. When Mason finally fell silent, the only sound in the cabin was the spitting of the fire. For a long time, Caleb said nothing. He simply stared into the flames. Then he spoke, his voice low and raspy, heavy with the weight of unshed tears. 5 years ago, he began, I had a wife, Sarah, and a daughter, Emily. She was 6. She loved the birds in the forest. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a small, worn object, a little bird carved from a piece of pale birchwood, its surface smoothed by years of handling. I carved this for her last birthday. He looked at the carving, but his eyes were seeing the past. Then the sickness came. It wasn't normal. It was fast. A fever that the doctor couldn't break. A chill that no fire could warm. They were gone in 3 days. Both of them. He clenched his fist around the wooden bird, his knuckles white. After the funeral, I started seeing things. Shadows in the woods where they shouldn't be. Animals with the wrong eyes. The world was broken, and no one else could see it. He finally looked up at Mason, and for the first time, the hunter's rage was gone, replaced by a raw, gaping wound of grief. I left town because I thought I was going mad. I came out here to hunt the things that I saw, to find a reason, to find something to blame. Mason looked from the hunter's tormented face to the small wooden bird. In that moment, his mission, which had felt so vast and mythical, became deeply personal. This was the true cost of the Blight. This was the pain he was fighting to prevent. It wasn't about saving an abstract concept like the land. It was about saving families. It was about making sure no other child's toys became a father's painful memento. Caleb carefully placed the wooden bird back in its pouch. His decision was made. For 5 years, I've been hunting ghosts in the dark, Blacksmith. You're the first person to ever give my ghosts a name, a leader, a place where I can find them. He stood up, his movements once again filled with a predator's purpose. The people in that town, they can rot for all I care. They whispered about me when my family died, called me cursed. But Sarah and Emily, they loved these woods. This thing you call the Blight, it's poisoning their memory. For them, I'll help you. The alliance was forged not with a handshake, but with a shared, solemn vow. The mood in the cabin shifted instantly. Grief was packed away, replaced by the cold, hard pragmatism of a military briefing. Caleb strode over to one of the large maps on his wall. Evelyn is right. The old North Ridge Mine. It's the deepest scar in these mountains. If I were a thing of shadow, that's where I'd make my den. His finger, calloused and sure, traced a path across the map that bypassed the main trails. The journey will take us 2 days if we push hard. We'll stick to the high ground. The Hollowed seem to prefer the valleys and low-lying fog. We'll travel light, take only what we need to fight and to survive. He began pointing out landmarks, potential ambush points, and safe places to find clean water. His intimate knowledge of the corrupted wilderness was an asset Mason's raw power could never replace. As the first, pale light of dawn began to filter through the cabin's single window, the 2 men readied their gear. Mason checked the leather straps on his bracers, his hammer hanging ready at his belt. Caleb strung his bow and methodically inspected each of his arrows, his movements economical and precise. The small cabin, for so long a monument to one man's lonely grief, had become a war room. The Guardian and the Avenger, the blacksmith's hammer and the hunter's arrow, were united. They were about to journey into the heart of the enemy's power, 2 men against an army of shadows, each driven by their own ghosts. They set out at first light, 2 solitary figures moving against a world that had grown cold and hostile. The grim determination of their mission hung in the air between them, a silent, shared understanding that left no room for unnecessary words. Caleb took the lead immediately, his movements a fluid and economic dance of survival. He moved not like a man walking through the woods, but like a part of the woods itself, his eyes constantly scanning, his ears tuned to the unnatural silence. He was a relentless teacher. He taught Mason to read the subtle signs of the Blight's passage that he would have otherwise missed. He pointed out pine trees whose needles had turned black and brittle from the ground up, a sign of poisoned soil. He showed him claw marks on rocks that wept a slow, tar-like sap. He taught Mason how to tell the difference between the natural cold of the high altitudes and the deep, life-draining chill of a place where the Blight's influence was strong. For the first time, Mason was not just reacting to the Blight's horrors, he was learning to hunt them. They were a study in contrasts, a perfect partnership of quiet intensity. Caleb was the eyes and ears, his bow the swift, silent answer to any distant threat. Mason was the heart and the muscle, his hammer the undeniable, final word against the darkness they faced. Their first true test as a team came as they navigated a narrow pass between two sheer rock faces. The path was treacherous, and a strange, whispering wind swirled around them. "Stay close," Caleb muttered, his eyes scanning the high, craggy ledges above. "And don't listen to anything you hear." Mason soon understood why. A soft, plaintive cry drifted down from the rocks, the voice of a young girl. "Daddy? I'm lost, help me, Daddy." Caleb froze for a half second, his entire body tensing, the muscles in his jaw tight. Mason saw the flicker of raw pain in his eyes before it was replaced by a cold, hard fury. "Whisperers," Caleb snarled, knocking an arrow without looking away from the rocks. "Hollowed spirits. They use your heart to break your mind." Another voice joined the first, this one directed at Mason, sounding eerily like Ben the Logger. "He's a madman, Mason, leading you to your death. Run." The psychological assault was potent, designed to sow discord and panic. But Mason had faced the thorn of despair. He had been tested in the crucible of his own deepest fears and emerged stronger. He planted his feet, gripping his hammer. "Where are they?" "Everywhere and nowhere," Caleb answered, his gaze finally locking onto a flicker of movement high above. He loosed an arrow in a single fluid motion. It struck something Mason couldn't see, and a pained, bird-like shriek echoed through the pass. "They're fast. My arrows can wound them, pin them, but they don't kill them." "Then pin them for me," Mason said, his voice a low growl of determination. A new dance began. A shadowy, flitting form would appear on a ledge. "There," Caleb would bark, firing an arrow that would strike the rock face, its shaft vibrating as it momentarily pierced the creature's ethereal form. The whisperer would shriek, its form solidifying for a precious second. In that second, Mason would slam the base of the rock face with his hammer. He didn't need to make direct contact. The shockwave of pure, cleansing energy that erupted from the blow would travel up the stone, and the creature would be vaporized with a final, agonized cry. They worked in perfect, deadly sync. Caleb would spot and pin. Mason would destroy. One by one, the whispers faded until silence returned to the pass. They stood back to back, breathing heavily, the first trial of their partnership overcome. As they rested for a moment, catching their breath, Mason looked at his new ally with a deeper respect. "How did you live with that?" he asked quietly. Hearing those voices all these years. Caleb didn't look at him, his gaze lost in the distance. "Most days I didn't," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But my anger was louder than their whispers. Hunting them was the only thing that kept the grief from eating me alive. At least now I know where to point that anger." He finally turned to Mason, a look of grudging respect in his sharp eyes. "I wouldn't have survived that pass alone today. They're getting stronger." "Neither would I," Mason admitted honestly. They continued their journey, their shared silence now one of comfortable, mutual reliance. As dusk began to settle on the second day, they reached the crest of the final ridge. Caleb raised a hand, and they dropped to a crouch, peering through a thicket of withered pines. Below them lay a valley shrouded in gloom. In the side of the opposite mountain was a gaping, black wound, the entrance to the North Ridge mine. It did not just look like a cave, it looked like a mouth, exhaling a thick, roiling fog of pure blight that blanketed the valley floor. The air was visibly distorted around it, and the land was a barren wasteland of dead trees and black rock. Shadowy, humanoid forms, the Hollowed, patrolled the entrance with a chilling, silent purpose. The corruption here was a physical, palpable thing, a pressure that squeezed the air from the lungs and chilled the soul. They had arrived. Below them lay the heart of the enemy's stronghold, Caleb silently checked the string on his bow. Mason gripped the worn leather handle of his hammer. They had survived the journey and forged a partnership in the face of horror. Now, the true battle was about to begin. Night fell, and the valley below was plunged into an even deeper darkness, punctuated only by the sickly green glow of the Blight's energy. From their perch on the ridge, Mason and Caleb watched the enemy. The Hollowed patrolled the entrance to the mine with a relentless, jerky purpose. They were silhouettes of men, soldiers of shadow, and their numbers were greater than Mason had feared. A frontal assault would be a death sentence. "Look at their patrol routes," Caleb whispered, his voice a low breath in the cold air. "They're predictable. They follow the same path, over and over. They're like puppets on a string. Mindless." He pointed to the deep shadows cast by a pile of old mining equipment. "They avoid the deepest darkness. They're drawn to movement, but their senses are dull. We don't fight our way in. We slip past them." Their descent into the valley was a descent into a nightmare. The ground was loose shale that shifted and slid under their boots, threatening to send them tumbling with every step. The blight fog grew thicker as they went lower, a cold, clammy blanket that muffled all sound and clung to them, seeding thoughts of doubt and exhaustion in their minds. Mason could feel the sunstone in his pouch working overtime, its gentle warmth a small, personal shield against the despair-inducing chill of the fog. They communicated with hand signals Caleb had taught him, two ghosts moving through a haunted landscape. They reached the valley floor, hiding in the shadow of a massive, rust-eaten or cart. The main entrance to the mine loomed before them, a massive, arched maw from which the fog poured like a foul breath. Dozens of hollowed soldiers patrolled the entrance. It was impassable. "There's another way," Caleb breathed, his mouth close to Mason's ear. "My grandfather worked this mine. He used to tell stories. The main shaft is for ore, but the men needed air." He pointed up the sheer rock face to the right of the main entrance. "About 50 feet up, there should be a ventilation shaft. It will be a hard climb, but they won't be guarding it." The climb was a grueling test of nerve and strength. The rock was cold and slick with a foul, dark slime. Handholds were scarce, and the fog swirled around them, trying to disorient them and trick their perception of distance. It was during this perilous ascent that they encountered the mine's next layer of defense. Floating in the air at intervals up the rock face were new horrors, gazers. They were stationary, ethereal sentinels, appearing as little more than a single, large, floating eye that burned with the same green, malevolent light as the blight itself. Their gaze swept back and forth in slow, methodical patterns. "Don't let the light touch you," Caleb hissed from just above Mason. "It's a psychic alarm. If it sees us, the whole army will know we're here." The climb became a deadly puzzle. They had to time their movements perfectly, scrambling from one deep shadow to the next in the few seconds when the sweeping gaze of the sentinels was pointed away from them. Mason, a blacksmith whose work was about stability and solid ground, felt his muscles screaming in protest. At one point, his foot slipped on a patch of slime. A small cascade of pebbles rattled down the rock face. Instantly, the nearest gazer's eye snapped toward the sound, its beam of green light cutting through the fog and sweeping toward them. Mason was frozen, flattened against the rock, with nowhere to hide. Just as the light was about to touch him, the sharp twang of Caleb's bowstring sounded from above. An arrow, fletched in black, streaked through the air. It didn't hit the ethereal gazer, but struck the rock face a dozen yards to the side with a loud crack. The gazer's attention was immediately diverted to the new sound, its eyes swiveling to investigate the impact. It was the split second Mason needed to haul himself over a ledge and into the safety of a deep crevice. He lay there, his heart hammering against his ribs as Caleb silently dropped down beside him. A nod of thanks was all they could exchange. Their partnership, Caleb's quick thinking and precision, Mason's strength and resolve, was the only thing keeping them alive. They finally reached the ventilation shaft. It was a dark, narrow hole, barely wide enough for a man to fit through, set deep into the mountainside. A fall wind gusted from its depths, carrying the stench of rot, wet stone, and a sharp, metallic tang of concentrated corruption. From deep within, they could hear a low, continuous whisper, like thousands of voices murmuring at once, punctuated by a distant, rhythmic, pounding sound. They had breached the outer defenses. They were inside. Caleb unslung a coil of rope from his pack, his face set like stone. They stood at the edge of the abyss, two mortal men preparing to descend into the heart of an ancient evil. There was no turning back now. Caleb, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had faced death many times, secured the rope to a sturdy rock outcropping. He gave it 3 sharp tugs, nodded in satisfaction, and then disappeared into the black maw of the ventilation shaft without a word. Mason followed, his heart pounding against his ribs. The descent was a claustrophobic, sensory nightmare. The shaft was tight, the rock scraping against his shoulders, and it was coated in a cold, greasy slime that made his grip treacherous. As they moved deeper into the mountain, the vague whispers they'd heard from outside grew louder, clearer. They were a maddening chorus of 1,000 despairing voices, speaking in overlapping fragments of misery and pain. It was the sound of lost souls, and it emanated from the very stone around them, as if the mountain itself were weeping. They finally landed on the hard-packed dirt of a narrow, disused tunnel. Pulling the rope down after them, they were plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. The only illumination was the soft, warm glow from the sunstone in Mason's pouch, a tiny island of light in an ocean of black. The rhythmic, thunderous pounding they had heard from the ridge was much louder now, a deep, concussive thump, thump, thump that vibrated through the soles of their boots. It was the dying heartbeat of the mountain. "West Tunnel," Caleb breathed, his voice barely audible over the whispers. "The main haulage route. It should lead us to the central chamber." He led them through a maze of intersecting tunnels. Here, the blight was not just a presence, it was the environment itself. The walls were caked in the thick, pulsating black moss, which seemed to breathe in time with the rhythmic pounding. The air was heavy with the smell of ozone and decay. Following the deafening sound, they finally arrived at a ledge overlooking a cavern of horrifying scale. What they saw below extinguished any remaining hope for a simple fight. This was not a lair. This was a factory. In the center of the vast cavern stood a monstrous figure, easily 20 feet tall. It was a vaguely humanoid creature forged from rusted mining equipment, jagged rock, and pure, coalesced shadow. In its massive hands, it held a hammer of blackened, pitted iron. This was not the general, Mason sensed, but a powerful lieutenant, a forge warden. It stood before a row of massive, flat-topped rocks that served as hellish anvils. And Mason saw what it was forging. Floating in the cavern, trapped in shimmering cages of dark energy, were hundreds of faint, wispy lights. They were spirits, the lost souls of those who had died in the forest, their forms flickering with residual humanity. Thump. The forge warden brought its hammer down upon one of the dark anvils. A shockwave of pure blight energy, a visible ripple of green-black lightning, pulsed through the cavern. One of the trapped spirits convulsed, its light flickering violently before being extinguished, twisted, and reformed by the dark energy into the shadowy, humanoid shape of a hollowed soldier. The newly created creature, its movements stiff and unnatural, shambled out of the cavern through a large tunnel, presumably to join the army guarding the entrance. Thump. Another soul was unmade. Another soldier was born. Mason watched in stunned horror. It was a sickening perversion of his own craft. A forge, a hammer, an anvil. But instead of shaping steel with fire and skill, this abomination was unmaking souls with despair and violence. He now understood the source of the army and the rhythmic, heartbreaking sound that echoed through the mountain. He and Caleb were hidden in the shadows of the ledge, but there were dozens of finished hollowed milling about the cavern floor below, along with the towering forge warden. A direct assault was impossible. They would be overwhelmed in seconds. "We can't fight that," Mason breathed, stating the obvious. Caleb didn't answer immediately, his sharp hunter's eyes scanning the cavern, not at the enemies, but at the structure of the cavern itself. "No," he finally whispered. "We can't. So we don't." He pointed upward. High above the forge warden, a colossal, pointed formation of rock hung from the cavern ceiling like a dagger, thousands of tons of stone held in place by 2 thick, stone support pillars. The pillars, once part of the mountain's natural structure, were now black and crumbling, deeply corroded by the blight's influence. "The miners called that the widow's tooth," Caleb murmured, his voice tight with tension. "They were always terrified of it falling. The support pillars are rotten. If they were to break..." The desperate, insane plan formed between them without another word needing to be spoken. They would not fight the monster. They would bury it. Caleb drew an arrow from his quiver. I'll draw their attention, give you a clear path to the first pillar. You have the strength to break them, but you'll only get one chance at each. The rhythmic thump of the dark hammer echoed below, a ticking clock counting down the destruction of another soul. Mason gripped his own hammer, its weight a familiar comfort. His task was clear. He would use his blacksmith's hammer not to fight, but to do what it did best, to break things. Mason and Caleb stood poised in the shadows of the ledge, the rhythmic, soul-crushing thump of the unmaking forge below them setting a grim cadence for the battle to come. There was no more time for words. They exchanged a final, resolute nod. It was a promise. They would succeed, or they would die here together. Caleb moved first. He stepped to the very edge of the precipice, drew an arrow with a specially carved, hollow head, and took a deep breath. He loosed the arrow not at an enemy, but at the far wall of the cavern. It flew through the foul air, emitting a high-pitched, piercing shriek that cut through the cacophony of whispers. The screamer arrow struck the wall and shattered, its cry echoing through the vast chamber. The effect was instantaneous. Every hollowed soldier on the floor below froze, their shadowy heads snapping in the direction of the sound. The colossal forge warden stopped mid-swing, its own hammer hovering over a dark anvil, its glowing green eyes scanning the darkness. The distraction was perfect. Now, Caleb hissed. Mason didn't hesitate. He launched himself from the ledge, landing with a jarring impact on the slick cavern floor. He ignored the pain in his knees and broke into a dead sprint, his target the first of the two crumbling support pillars. The ground was treacherous, and the very air seemed to push back against him, thick with the blight's oppressive energy. He could feel the dozens of hateful gazes leaving the far wall and starting to turn toward him. He was running out of time. He reached the pillar, a thick, blackened column of rock, pulsing with dark veins of corruption. The forge warden had seen him now. It let out a deafening roar, a sound of grinding metal and 1,000 tortured souls, and began to lumber toward him, its speed shockingly fast for a creature of its size. Mason planted his feet, raised his hammer, and swung. He poured everything he had into the blow, his physical strength, the legacy of the Guardians, and the desperate hope for the world above. The impact was not a simple crack of stone on stone. It was a thunderclap. A shockwave of brilliant golden light erupted from the hammer, shattering the blight's hold on the pillar. The corrupted rock groaned, fractured, and then exploded into a cloud of dust and rubble. The entire cavern shuddered violently. A shower of small rocks and dust rained down from the ceiling. The great Widow's Tooth formation high above shifted with a deep, grinding protest. The plan was working, but the enemy was upon him. The Forge Warden charged, its massive strides closing the distance, while the army of Hollowed swarmed toward him from all sides. From his perch above, Caleb became a blur of motion. Arrows flew from his bow, a relentless stream of black-fletched death. He was not aiming to kill, he knew he couldn't, but to maim, to hinder. He targeted the legs and joints of the advancing Hollowed, his broadheads shredding their shadowy forms, causing them to stumble and momentarily dissolve before reforming. He was buying Mason seconds with every shot. Mason raced for the second pillar, the Forge Warden's thunderous footsteps shaking the very ground beneath him. A Hollowed soldier lunged from the gloom, its spectral claws reaching for him. Without breaking stride, Mason swung his hammer in a low arc, connecting with the creature and blasting it into nothingness. The air was a storm of Caleb's arrows, shrieking spirits, and falling debris. He reached the final pillar just as the Forge Warden closed in, raising its own colossal, dark hammer to deliver a world-ending blow. Mason had no time to aim, no time for a full swing. He pivoted, putting the last of his strength into a desperate, horizontal strike. Crack. The second impact rang out, another blinding flash of golden energy. The final support pillar shattered. High above, a final, deafening groan of tortured stone echoed through the cavern. The Widow's Tooth, the dagger of rock weighing thousands of tons, broke free. Time seemed to slow. The Forge Warden, its hammer still raised, looked up, the green fire in its eyes widening in what looked like genuine shock. Mason was already scrambling, diving away, trying to escape the epicenter of the coming destruction. The world dissolved into a deafening roar as the ceiling began to collapse. The last thing he saw before throwing his arms over his head was the colossal rock formation plummeting down, a mountain falling within a mountain, aimed directly at the heart of the unmaking forge. The world ended in a symphony of roaring, grinding stone. Mason was thrown from his feet by a titanic shockwave as the mountain tore itself apart. He had a brief, terrifying sensation of weightlessness before crashing hard against the cavern floor. The air was instantly filled with a choking, impenetrable cloud of dust and pulverized rock. The deafening noise was absolute, a physical pressure that vibrated through his bones, and then it was all replaced by a sudden, ringing silence and the blackest darkness he had ever known. He came to with a gasp, his lungs on fire as he inhaled the thick, gritty air. His entire body ached, and a sharp, searing pain shot through his left shoulder. He was partially buried under a pile of smaller debris. Pushing the rocks off himself with his good arm, he sat up, his head swimming. The sunstone's pouch, still at his belt, cast a faint, hazy glow, a tiny sphere of light in the suffocating dust. Slowly, his senses returned. The rhythmic, soul-destroying pounding of the unmaking forge was gone. The incessant, maddening whispers of the lost souls were silenced. The cavern as he knew it no longer existed. In its place was a mountain of freshly fallen rock, a tomb of their own making. They had done it. They had buried the Forge Warden and its entire horrific operation. But the victory felt hollow in the face of their new reality. "Caleb," Mason yelled, his voice a raw, hoarse croak. The dust swallowed the sound. Panic, cold and sharp, began to pierce through his shock. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the agony in his shoulder, and stared up at the hazy darkness where the ledge had been. "Caleb," for a terrifying moment, there was no answer. Then, a weak, dust-choked cough echoed from above, followed by a groan. "Here," Caleb's voice called back, strained with pain. "Still here, more or less." Relief washed over Mason, so potent it almost buckled his knees. He began to navigate the treacherous, unstable new landscape, climbing over massive slabs of rock and loose scree. He finally found him. A small section of the ledge had miraculously held, but Caleb was pinned beneath a heavy, jagged boulder that had fallen from above, his left leg trapped and twisted at an unnatural angle. "My leg's broken," Caleb grunted, his face pale with pain in the sunstone's faint glow. "The rock's too heavy. I can't shift it." Mason sized up the boulder. It was massive, easily half a ton of solid granite. But looking at his friend, trapped and helpless, Mason felt a surge of power that had nothing to do with the hammer lying nearby. It was the deep, quiet strength he'd always possessed, the strength of his lineage, the power of a guardian. He wedged his fingers under the edge of the great stone, planted his feet, and pulled. With a roar that was part effort and part pure defiance, he heaved. Muscles screamed, his injured shoulder burned, but the rock shifted, inch by painful inch, just enough for Caleb to drag his mangled leg free. As the dust began to settle, a new and far more dreadful reality became clear. The ventilation shaft they had entered through was completely gone, buried under the rockfall. The main tunnel leading to the forge was also sealed. There was no way out. They were trapped deep in the wounded heart of the mountain. It was then that they both saw it. At the base of the massive rockslide, where the foundation of the cavern had been shattered, a new fissure had been torn open in the bedrock. And from this fissure, a faint, yet intensely malevolent, green light was pulsing. The cold that emanated from it was a physical thing, a soul-deep chill that made the blight fog outside feel like a warm summer breeze. The power seeping from that crack was ancient, intelligent, and infinitely more powerful than the mindless rage of the Forge Warden. A horrifying realization dawned on Mason. "We didn't kill it," he whispered. "We just knocked on its door." They had not destroyed the head of the snake. They had merely destroyed a single fawn. The Forge Warden was a lieutenant, a gatekeeper. The true general, the core intelligence of the blight in this region, had been dwelling deeper still, in chambers below the forge. And their act of destruction had just blasted open a direct path to its throne room. Caleb, leaning heavily against the rock wall, began to fashion a crude splint for his leg using strips of his leather tunic and the shaft of a broken arrow. He looked from his mangled leg to the ominous green glow, a grim, ironic smile twisting his lips. "Well, blacksmith," he said, his voice laced with the gallows humor of a man with nothing left to lose. "Looks like we found the general's private entrance." They were no longer hunters stalking their prey. They were wounded, exhausted, and trapped in the antechamber of a god. Their only way out was forward, into the waiting darkness. They stood at the edge of the abyss, two broken figures silhouetted against an evil green glow. The dust had settled, revealing the true extent of their desperate gamble. They had won the battle only to find themselves standing at the gates of hell. Caleb leaned heavily on a makeshift crutch he'd fashioned from a discarded pickaxe, his face a pale mask of agony. Mason's left arm hung uselessly at his side, his shoulder a nexus of searing pain. Despair, colder and sharper than any blight-induced chill, threatened to overwhelm them. They were trapped, wounded, and facing an enemy far greater than they had ever imagined. "This is it then," Caleb said, his voice a ragged whisper. There was no fear in it, only a profound, weary resignation. The end of the hunt. Mason looked at his friend, at the deep lines of grief and pain etched onto his face. He thought of the scar on the heartwood, a wound he had sworn to help heal. Hope. It was the answer at the threshold. It was the weapon against the thorn. It had to be the answer now. He would not let their journey end in the silent despair this place promised. Reaching into his pocket with his good hand, he withdrew the final gift from the sanctuary, the single, golden leaf of the heartwood. It pulsed with a gentle, life-affirming warmth. "Evelyn said this was for our greatest need," Mason said. "I can think of no greater need than this." He crushed the leaf in his palm. It dissolved not into dust, but into a cascade of pure, golden light that flowed over them like warm water. The effect was instantaneous. The searing pain in Mason's shoulder was soothed, the torn muscles mending, leaving only a deep, dull ache in its place. He could move his arm again. For Caleb, the light could not knit bone, but it washed away the sharpest edges of his agony, replacing it with a manageable throb and filling him with a surge of strength he hadn't felt in years. It was a final blessing, a moment of grace before the final battle. With a shared, determined look, they began their descent. Mason went first, helping the hobbled Caleb down the treacherous slope of the fissure. They emerged into a chamber utterly unlike the crude mine above. It was a vast, natural grotto, its walls lined with jagged, perfectly black crystals that seemed to drink the light and pulse with a slow, sickly green energy. The air was unnaturally still, cold, and crackled with immense, controlled power. In the center of the chamber, atop a raised dais of the same obsidian-like crystal, sat a throne. And upon the throne sat the general. It was not a beast of rage and fury like the Forge Warden. This creature was one of intelligent, refined malice. Its form was sleek and vaguely humanoid, sculpted from pure, swirling shadow and encased in a translucent armor of the black crystal. It had no face, only a smooth, polished surface where one should be. But deep within its helmet-like head, 2 points of intense, hateful green light burned, the eyes of an ancient, patient predator. It did not move. It simply watched them approach. As they stepped onto the crystalline floor, its voice slithered directly into their minds. It was not a sound, but a cold, sharp thought, dripping with ancient contempt. "So, the little sparks of hope have found their way to the heart of the shadow," the general projected. "You have done me a great service. The forge was a crude, noisy affair. This collapse, it has opened a much more direct path for my influence to spread. I was content to wait, to gather my strength slowly, but you have brought the key to the lock." The 2 points of light fixed on Mason's hammer. "The tool of the enemy. It carries the seed of the first light. Once I consume it, and the heartwood's dying echo within you, nothing will stop me." The general's attention then shifted to Caleb. The hunter cried out and staggered, his hands flying to his head as the creature assaulted his mind. "You seek vengeance, little hunter," the voice whispered, for Caleb alone. "But your fight is with life itself. Life is chaos. Life is pain. I offer you peace. I offer you the quiet that you crave. Join your wife and daughter. They are with me now, silent, at peace." An illusion shimmered in the air before Caleb. The forms of his wife and daughter, their faces pale and emotionless, their eyes empty. Caleb stared, his resolve crumbling, his grief a weapon turned against him. But Mason would not allow it. The sight of his friend's torment, the general's cruel, calculated evil, ignited a fire in his soul. "Get out of his head," Mason roared, his voice the first and only true sound in the dead silence of the grotto. He raised his hammer high, and it blazed with a brilliant, defiant golden light, channeling every ounce of his will, every memory of his ancestors, every shred of hope he had left. The pure light of his defiance shattered the illusion before Caleb. Shaken from the vision by Mason's cry, Caleb gasped, his eyes clearing. He looked from Mason's radiant hammer to the obsidian throne, his grief transmuting into a final, white-hot coal of fury. The time for words was over. Mason charged, his hammer held aloft like a vengeful star, a blacksmith's son ready to shatter a god. Caleb, leaning on his pickaxe crutch, drew his last arrow, his aim steady, his purpose absolute. The final, desperate battle for the soul of Havenwood had begun. Mason charged across the crystalline floor, his hammer a golden comet in the oppressive gloom. The general rose from its obsidian throne, not with the lumbering rage of the Forge Warden, but with a liquid, terrifying grace. Shadow and crystal flowed as it moved, its form impossibly fast. It met Mason's charge not with a roar, but with a chilling silence, conjuring a long, sharp shard of black crystal from its own arm. The clash of hammer on crystal sent a psychic shriek through the cavern. Golden light warred against green-black energy. Everywhere Mason's hammer struck, the general's crystalline armor cracked and spiderwebbed, but the creature was too fast, its movements a blur of deadly precision. It spun past Mason's guard, and its obsidian blade sliced across his ribs, a wound that burned with a life-draining cold. As Mason fought for his life, Caleb fought for his soul. The general's telepathic whispers were relentless, a venomous assault on his deepest grief. She is waiting for you, Hunter. The quiet is so peaceful. Let go. But Caleb, anchored by the sight of Mason's defiant stand, held his ground. He saw the general's arrogance, its complete focus on the Guardian. And in that focus, he saw his opening. For a fraction of a second, as the creature raised its arm to deliver a final, fatal blow to Mason, the swirling mass of shadows in its chest parted, revealing a pulsating core of pure, venomous green light. Its heart, with a ragged cry that was a prayer to his lost family, Caleb drew his last arrow. He poured everything he was into that single shot, 5 years of rage, a lifetime of love, and a father's undying grief. The arrow flew, no longer just wood and stone, but a missile of pure, focused emotion. It struck the green core with unerring accuracy. The general screamed. It was a sound both physical and psychic, a tidal wave of pure agony that blasted through the grotto. The crystalline armor around its chest exploded outward. The creature was wounded, exposed. Mason, bleeding and staggering, saw his one and only chance. Ignoring the fire in his side, he raised his hammer for the last time. This was not a blow of anger, but of sacrifice. It was for Havenwood. It was for Caleb. It was for the wounded Heartwood. It was for hope itself. He put every last shred of his being into the final swing and brought the hammer down onto the exposed, screaming heart of the Blight. The impact created a silent, violent implosion. Light and shadow rushed inward, consuming each other. The general's form dissolved, not into dust, but into a vortex of unstable, warring energies. The grotto groaned, and the black crystals began to shatter. The entire chamber was collapsing. Mason was at the center of the vortex, his life force being torn away. He knew he could not escape. He turned to Caleb, who was being dragged toward the implosion by the immense gravitational pull. With the last of his strength, Mason shoved his friend, a blacksmith's powerful heave, sending the hunter tumbling backward, away from the chaos and toward the relative safety of the fissure. Live was the last word Mason spoke. The chamber collapsed in on itself, a final, thunderous roar that sealed the fissure forever. And then, for the first time in centuries, the mountain was silent. 1 month later, the sun shone warmly on Havenwood. The unnatural winter had broken, giving way to a bright, clear autumn. The sickness that had plagued the town vanished as mysteriously as it had arrived. The forest, though still bearing the scars of the Blight's touch, felt clean again. The air was fresh, and the birds had returned to sing in the trees. Caleb, leaning on a finely crafted wooden cane, made his way to Evelyn's small cottage. He was gaunt and moved with a limp that would be with him for the rest of his life, but his eyes were clear. The burning rage was gone, replaced by a quiet, solemn peace. He had spent weeks slowly, painstakingly finding a way out of the now inert mine, his survival a testament to his skill and his will to honor his friend's sacrifice. He and Evelyn sat in silence for a long time after he finished telling her the whole story. On the table between them lay Mason's hammer. Caleb had found it lying at the very edge of the sealed fissure, miraculously unharmed. It was now just a hammer, a heavy, perfectly balanced, masterfully crafted tool. Its divine light was dormant, its purpose fulfilled. Later that day, Caleb walked to the small, quiet cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. He knelt before two simple headstones, Sarah and Emily. From his pouch, he took the small, worn wooden bird. For 5 years, it had been a symbol of his pain, a reminder of what he had lost. Now it was a symbol of what had been saved. He gently placed the carving on his daughter's grave. He was no longer a hunter of ghosts. He had faced the source of his pain and, with the help of a brave blacksmith, had given it a final end. Mason Johnson, the Guardian, was gone, his name unknown to the town he had saved. But his sacrifice was written in the warm sunlight, in the clean air, and in the quiet peace of a father who could finally begin to heal. The world was safe. The dawn had come,